So what is resting membrane potential? So here the neuron not receives any type of action potential whenever at the time of the neuron not going to be excited. That time some of the electrical generation is takes place. Some of the electricity is generation is takes place. So that is called resting membrane potential. So neuron membrane contains various selectively permeable ion channels. So how the resting membrane potential is generates, how the voltage is generates while at the time of neuron at the time of resting stage also, because of presence of ion channels in the region of axolemma. So in a resting neuron not conducting impulse, the axonal membrane is more permeable to K plus ions and nearly impermeable to Na plus ions. At the time of resting, the neuron consists with the neuron permeable to K plus ion. Potassium ions only permeable from outer to inner, and Na plus sodium ions are impermeable. Also, the membrane is impermeable to negatively charged protein in axoplasm. So the membrane is impermeable to negatively charged protein into axoplasm. So inside the axoplasm, negatively charged proteins are presented. So negatively charged proteins also impermeable. So during resting stage, what are permeable? So only potassium permeable. So what are impermeable? So sodium is impermeable, and there is negatively charged proteins also impermeable. Therefore, concentration of potassium and negatively charged proteins in axoplasm is high, and concentration of Na plus is low. Obviously, whenever inside of the axoplasm, so potassium concentration is more. Why potassium concentration is more? Because potassium only permeable, sodium is not permeable. Potassium concentration is more, and what is more? Negatively charged proteins concentration also more, right? So the fluid outside the axon contains low concentration of potassium and high concentration of Na plus. So whenever outside the exoplasm there is potassium is high, potassium is low, and sodium is high, obviously, because sodium is impermeable to inside of exoplasm. This forms an ionic or concentration gradient across the resting membrane. Gradient means changes, right? So outer region and inner region, outer exoplasm and inner exoplasm means outside of the neuron. So this is outside of the neuron and inside of the neuron exoplasm. So inside of the exoplasm means the inside of the axon, right? Same ion concentration is not presented. So concentration gradient is maintained across the resting membrane. The ionic gradients are maintained by the active transport of ions by the sodium and the potassium pump. So whatever we discussed here, this is takes place through sodium and potassium channels are separate, right? But there is a specialized ion channel is presented, that is called sodium potassium pump. The ionic gradients are maintained by the active transport of ions by the sodium potassium pump. It transports 3 sodium outwards and for 2 potassium into the cell. So through the sodium and potassium pump, what happens? 3 sodium outwards means inside of the exoplasm to outside of the exoplasm, and so 2 potassium into the cell. So 2 potassium inside to the cell, outside to inside of the cell, and 3 sodium ions inside to outside of the outside, sorry, 3 sodium outwards means inside to outside, and 2 potassium outside to inside of the cell, right? So by this movement, what happens? By the sodium potassium pump, inside concentration of sodium is increases, outside potassium inside there is inside potassium concentration is increases, outside sodium concentration is increases. Clear? Right. As a result, the outer surface becomes positively charged and inner surface become negatively charged. So sodium potassium pump is works. So based on that, inside there is more potassium and more negative charged proteins. So outside less potassium, low potassium, and more sodium. So that only. So what happens? Inside there is negatively charged. Inside surface becomes inner surface becomes negatively charged. That condition is called polarization. So what is meant by polarization? At the time of resting stage, neuron not conducting any type of impulse, that time inner side of the exoplasm, so negative charge is developed. The negative charge is developed, that is called polarization. So the electrical potential differences across the resting plasma membranes is called the resting potential. So what is meant by resting potential? The electrical potential differences across the resting plasma membrane is called as the resting potential. Obviously, why? Because whenever inside negative and outside positive, this is takes place throughout the axon length, whenever the neuron not receives any type of nerve impulse, right, or action potential. After this clear? Okay. So this is here. So this is resting stage. For example, you should take, this is the resting stage, inside negative charge and outside positive charge, inside negative and outside positive, inside negative, outside positive, right? So this condition is called resting potential or polarization. Polarization means, you should remember, inside negative charge, outside positive charge. How it is formed? Polarization. Polarization is formed because of there is sodium potassium pump and negatively charged proteins, and more sodium inside flows inside, and more potassium flows inside, and more sodium goes outside, okay, from exoplasm to outer. Okay, next one is action potential. Till now we discussed regarding about resting membrane potential, and next one is action potential. When a stimulus is applied, the membrane at the site A becomes permeable to Na plus. So here what happens? Till now we discussed regarding about resting membrane potential. In the resting membrane potential, only potassium is allowed inside. So whenever stimulus is applied, the membrane at the site A becomes permeable to sodium. So this site A, what happens whenever the stimulus is received by the neuron? So there is more sodium channels are opened, and sodium flows, the sodium inflow takes place, right? That is called sodium influx from outer to inner, right? This causes rapid influx of sodium and a reversal of the polarity at the site. So outer negative and inner positive, it is called depolarization. Here what happens? Whenever the more sodium ions are opens, so through the sodium ion channels, more sodium enters inside, so that only the sodium more sodium influxes takes place. So by that what happens? So the charge, the whatever the voltage is, differentiation takes place. So in polarization, what happens? In polarization, inside negative and outside positive, because of action potential, because of influx of sodium, the reversal of polarity takes place, means outer negative and inner positive, that is called depolarization. You should remember, polarization means inner negative, outer positive. So depolarization means inner positive and outer negative. And depolarization takes place when resting membrane potential, or action potential. In action potential only. So by what process depolarization occurs? By the influx of sodium from outer to inner. Clear? Right. The electrical potential difference during depolarization across the plasma membrane is called action potential or nerve impulse. The electrical potential difference during depolarization across the plasma membrane called action potential. So during polarization, that is called resting potential, and during depolarization it is called action potential. So in the NCERT, this diagram given, so this is site A and site B. So for example, this is the length of the axon, and right, so this is A site, this is B, this is C, this is A, this is B, right, as like that. So here what happens? First, this region is site on, for example, cell body, right? So from the cell body, the action potential is generates, right? So this